All right, I'll call today's planning commission meeting on September 22nd to order. It is 4:35. I believe all members are, oh, we're missing all but Levi, I believe. Right. Okay, we have a quorum. First up, approval of minutes, review and take action, site plan review minutes dated September 8th, and also the planning commission minutes dated September 8th.
Move approval of both.
Okay, motion for both by Krieger,
I'll second.
second by Kniezer. Okay, any questions, comments on it? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, thank you. Next, under business, we have review and discuss zoning ordinance bulk dimensional standards and land uses by Vanderwall. Okay,
All right. So we discussed about a month ago, or 2 months ago, I should say, the draft zoning districts. And so we utilized those draft zoning districts to frame the context of really what sets up the entirety of the zoning code rewrite. And that's the bulk dimensional standards and your land use standards. So for today's purposes, we provided you with a draft of those standards in table format and then descriptions of the land uses. There's 8 identified questions within the document that was provided in your packet. And so we are going to gather feedback from you all in relationship to those questions. But overall, today is one of many opportunities throughout this process that you will have to review and refine these. So I'm not saying like today is it, or we're done with this, we're moving on. With part 1, with other elements of things, we will continue to revise and refine these elements of things. So don't feel like if you miss something today that you missed the boat completely on having that discussion. When we're talking about the zoning code reorientation, reorganization, we'll be splitting up the code into part 1 and part 2. And this is for the ease of sort of getting through all of this information. And part 1, the real core elements are the zoning districts, the land uses, and the bulk dimensions. So that's where we're starting here today. And then we'll build it all into the text format, and then we'll work on part 2. So setting the stage for what's to come. Just a brief reminder as to what was in that audit memo from last year, talking about streamlining the process, aligning land uses with housing objectives, supporting mixed use, modernizing standards, improving user friendliness, and minimizing conditional use permits. So just a brief recap of the zoning districts. Here are the residential districts. On the left are existing, in the middle is what's proposed, and on the right is sort of the orientation there. We're proposing to remove a couple of the existing residential districts and add a couple, which you can see in the tables that you have as well. When we go to the commercial, mixed use, and industrial, again, you can see we're doing more consolidation with these zoning districts into hopefully a streamlined approach for the new districts. And then finally, there's some other like agriculture, airport, parks and recreation for specific different uses. And then we'll get into the overlays in a little bit more depth with part 1 versus right now at this time. So just a little bit of orientation on the draft requirements for the new zoning districts are inherently what we're talking about today. That's the setback, that's the height, that's the lot coverage. That's what we're referring to as bulk dimensions. And then the land uses, as you guys are familiar, what's permitted by right in each district, what's permitted with a conditional use permit, and what's not permitted. So if you've had a chance to look through them, this is a snippet of the bulk dimensional table. In black, this is the existing standard that you have today. In red, that's what's proposed new. I will admit, when we were trying to sift through what are the existing standards today, it is very difficult. And that is for a few reasons. There are a lot. And then secondarily, there are contradictions within the code, where in the zoning districts and the appendices, they have different listed standards. And so where you'll see slashes or you'll see and or whatever, that's because we couldn't necessarily decipher all of the existing standards. And so what we are proposing to do is really streamline this with a lot of different approaches that we'll talk about this evening. So just for example, if you're looking at this table, the top, we're looking at SR4, the existing zoning district, 8,000 square feet is the minimum lot size. What we're proposing in red is 7,000. So that's sort of an orientation as to what you're looking at. Then when we go to the land use tables, same thing. Black is existing, red is new. So when you see a C in there, that's to indicate conditional use. When you see a P, that's to indicate permitted by right. If you don't see anything in that cell, that's to indicate that it wouldn't be permitted in that zoning district as a land use. So same type of approach here, where you can see where we're proposing different approaches than maybe today, what we're proposing to mirror from today and add in new. So big picture, before we get started into talking a little bit more about these, one of the purposes of this rewrite is that the existing code has a lot of conditional uses. And we understand that one of the goals is to reduce the number of conditional uses. And so we also know that state law has changed where we need to have substantive evidence, fact-based analysis to deny a conditional use permit at this point in time. That's pretty difficult to get to that point. In most public hearing settings, in addition to or coupled with a conditional use, you will typically hear opinion-based evidence. And so that's typically where the neighbor says, I don't like this for X, Y, and Z reason. There's not an actual quantitative sort of evidence-based scenario for you to use that information to deny a conditional use. It puts you all in a very difficult position. And so what we're proposing to do is to remove a lot of what's conditional today and make it more oriented towards permitted by right. So with that said, basically one example I'll pull out of the table. Right now, if you wanted to build a new hotel in one of the business districts, it's required to have a conditional use permit. We all agree if you're traveling into town off the bypass, along one of those districts would be well suited for a hotel, right? Why is it a conditional use permit required when we all believe that it's permitted by right makes logical sense, right? And so the reorientation of this would make it permitted by right. You would still have the site plan come before the plan commission in that review. So it's not like we're just granting blanket approvals. We're still requiring that site plan procedure to be met, but we're not taking the additional step of the notice, the public hearing, the additional day requirements, and all that goes into a conditional use process. Additionally, what we'll end up with at the end of this process is that you may be experiencing more zoning map amendments than you do today. And the reason for that is we're making more zoning districts to create a situation where you have the ability to use the zoning map amendment process better than you do the conditional use process today. So an example would be maybe it's a lower density residential zoning district today. It's proposed for a higher density format. You would use the zoning map amendment process versus the conditional use process to determine if that made sense. There'd then be an accompanied site plan with that. So these are the 8 questions that we'll walk through. I've got a slide or 2 on each, and then I'm looking for feedback. Does the alternative approach make sense? Does some version of what we have today make more sense? And just have a discussion on that. Additionally, if there's anything else that we don't cover within these questions that you have a question about within the table, feel free to ask. I'm happy to walk through anything beyond these. But when Brian and I were reviewing these in depth, we were going more on the cell by cell basis and looking at these things. And these are the things that came sort of to the forefront as items we'd like to discuss with you. So this is not intended for you to read everything or even understand everything. What it's trying to basically say is on the left, those are the existing number of standards that we have in relationship to bulk dimensional standards, in particular related to density. So you have your typical lot requirements, your setback requirements, height. Then beyond that, we go into all different things such as building coverage, gross density, minimum dwelling unit dimensional size, maximum floors, maximum floor area, maximum building size, maximum building footprint. And so what you can see, there is a lot. What we're aiming to do is streamline that. So what you have in your table where it says none, that's indicated to say we're going to pull that provision out and no longer use that. We are really trying to streamline this to what really effectively gets us to a very similar point in terms of what we have in terms of standards, but oriented towards minimum lot requirements, minimum setback requirements, height, and impervious surface ratio. So that's sort of what you will see as a common thread throughout. When we looked at the existing standards, we found confusing situations. I think this is one you dealt with not too long ago. What's the max gross density for an infill lot? That doesn't really have, those two things don't match up together. A max gross density was intended to be something that applied over a brand new neighborhood, not an infill situation. You ran into it with an interpretation trying to determine what it should be. Why is it in there if it doesn't match what we're trying to accomplish? Conflicting standards, like I mentioned, and then overall too many standards, like I also mentioned. So what we're trying to do is really streamline it. So the diagram on the right, I think there's 6 or 8 total dimensions on this graphic. That's what we're trying to get to try and accomplish something very similar to what you have today, but much less cumbersome for both applicants and staff to administer and for yourselves to review and understand. So any feedback on this alternative approach? Does it make sense? Are we all sort of on the same?
Just that I love it and keep going.
Okay.
We've talked about it in this room a few times since I've, served here, and I think it's always a good idea wherever possible to increase clarity, make standards fewer where possible, make them,
Okay.
easier to understand. So I'm very eager to hear more.
All right. So this one, a little bit a higher, broader scale. I didn't go through every single situation where this is occurring within the bulk dimensional standards, but generally speaking, one of the approaches we're taking is that today we have large setback and lot size requirements for residential zoning districts. What this does is this means that there are definitely properties out there today, especially the older neighborhoods, where those standards don't even reflect what's on the ground. Additionally, you've had to review PUDs for brand new neighborhoods where why couldn't we just have base standards that reflect that, enable that? Why do they need to go through the PUD process? So what we are aiming to do by reducing setbacks and lot sizes is to accommodate both what's on the ground today and what's potentially to come through a variety of different formats, smaller single family, potentially rear access single family, small lot 2-family configurations, multifamily configurations, whether that's front loaded, whether that's rear loaded, whether that's interior oriented, and really try to address different situations, not only that we are seeing from modern building practices, but also to accommodate what we have in many older areas of the community. And so while I know I'm not going into the level of detail of talking about a 25-foot rear setback versus a 20-foot rear setback, this is what we're trying to accomplish in doing those types of changes. So if there is something specific we want to talk about, I'm open to it and we can do that. But generally, I just want to get perspective as to this is the path we're starting to go down, and it's directly related to addressing our housing situation and remedying existing issues. And we're all sort of on the same page there with that. Okay. So this one, a little bit different, increasing heights. Now, when you look at the existing heights, those are shown in orange associated with those zoning districts, the proposed are in green. The changes are for a variety of reasons. One being that when you look at the math in relationship to, I'll just pick one at the bottom, heavy industrial right now is 45 feet is the max height and 4 stories is the max. To accomplish 4 stories in modern building practices, it's 12 to 14 feet from floor to ceiling. Do the math there. That's 11 feet per story to get to 45. We don't even have the ability to get to 4 stories. Maybe in a creative format we might, but I'm just saying, like, these are the inconsistencies that we're finding in the existing code that we're trying to remedy. And so what we're building in is inherent flexibility. Now it's going to look like we are going up in scale. Not everyone that is going to come in with a development proposal is going to try and max out the height. What we're trying to do is build in the parameters in which we're working in. And what we're looking at in modern building practices, like I talked about, 12 to 14 foot roof to ceiling or floor to ceiling heights. And then there's also variation in roof type and roof elements. So we're giving ourselves a buffer of a couple of up to 5 feet on that. And so that's where these numbers derive from. Additionally, beyond that, we do have some pretty constrained height maximums right now. In particular, the highest density multifamily only zoning district is capped at 35 feet. Now we have existing examples within the community today that's 4 stories and greater than 35 feet. I mean, just, it's a different zoning district, but just some of the properties on the river, for example, that are all multifamily, those are 4 stories in height and they exceed this 35 foot. So we've already got examples in the community of this approach, and we're hoping to see more of that approach utilized in the future. And so it's a combination of various factors. We're reflecting modern practices, but we're also increasing it in certain areas to reflect what we want to see in the future as our goals. So I will note one additional element of things is that we're not, again, creating sort of a blanket wide open door here. So if you're thinking about that situation of the 4-story structure, like I just mentioned, if they're zoned something different today that other than that MR3 zoning district that we're talking about, they're going to have to request the zoning map amendment to get to the MR3. So that's where you come into play, as we're not using that CUP approach anymore for increasing height. What we're doing is saying that zoning map amendment process would facilitate the ability for us to have not only that conversation about does this make sense, but then the details come with the site plan at that point too. So I know that this can be sort of seen as a pretty big transition if you're looking at those numbers in static without that context. But I wanted to provide that context for you to say that, you know, I just reviewed a 4-story structure the other day in a different community that was 55 feet. It appears to be, you know, a regular 4-story, but that's what we're talking about with modern construction right now, and that would not be enabled under the existing code. Okay. Residential accessory structures, again, this is where we have a base standard 15 to 18 feet in a lot of our residential zoning districts. However, we have a CUP option that basically says you can increase that height. And I believe that you've reviewed some of those in the past. This creates issues. What are we, our standard should reflect what we're comfortable with, not what these certain provisions on one-off occasions should look like, right? So what we came up with was an idea to start the conversation was get rid of the CUP as part of this, utilize that 15 to 18 feet, continue that forward, but that would only apply in the instance where the accessory structure setbacks are met. So if you're looking at this image of a house, you see in the top left corner is a shed. That shed would be allowed to be that 15 to 18 feet because it's that close to the property line. However, if you wanted to exceed that height, you wanted a taller accessory garage, for example, that could be permitted on the same lot if you met the principal building setbacks, meaning that there's a little bit more of a buffer between the neighboring properties than what a shed would be. And so that's the theory behind that. Yes.
Well, that's an interesting topic to discuss too, because that has come up multiple times here in the past couple of years of people wanting to build larger than normally, approvable buildings on their
Right.
site.
So, we could certainly keep the CUP approach. I wouldn't recommend it, but if that's what you guys, you guys are giving direction to me. So if that's the direction you take, that's something we can talk about. This is just a method that I've used in other communities because of the fact that, in most instances, I'm not going to say all, but in most instances, if a shed is 3 foot from the property line and it's 10 feet tall, your neighbor probably doesn't have that big of an issue with it, just blanket statement. But if you're going to build a 20-foot a detached garage 3 feet from your neighbor's property line, that may be a different situation. They may feel differently about that. And so what we're trying to do is account for what would normally be within the principal building setback anyway. Why couldn't you do a larger accessory structure within that area? You would be able to do it with a principal structure. So it's trying to give some options for property owners. Additionally, what we could also build in is that no accessory structure can be taller than the principal structure. So even if these setbacks came into play, but the principal building, the house out there, was 20 feet tall, that would mean that the tallest the accessory structure could be is 20 feet tall to match that height. And so these are just ideas for you all to consider. And so I don't know, Brian, if you deal with this more often, and we had a lengthy discussion about it, how comfortable you feel with sort of this approach.
I think it has some merits. I think maybe the rear setback for the accessory structure would have to be relaxed a little bit to maybe push it back to, I don't know, 8 or 10 feet, something like that, so that you could have more flexibility in where you place that building in the back. But I think it has some merit.
Okay. Any other?
I think you
Comments?
just mentioned one of the things that I personally would like to see: the maximum height of an accessory structure not exceed the primary structure.
Yes.
I think that's one thing that I personally would like to see built into the new code.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So as you're envisioning it right now, would it still be possible to use the CUP process and there will just be fewer of them inevitably? Or are we saying we're going with a firm rule and there will be no more CUPs allowed? Because I share the goal of having fewer of them. I'm not sure if I share the goal of just saying outright, absolutely no path any further for some of those ideas. So I'm struggling to think of a good example, but if you have a ranch style house that is only 15 feet high and you want to build a 24-foot high shed out back for the toys, I mean, your neighbor could if they have a 2-story house, but you couldn't because you're stuck with a 1-story house, and if there's no CUP process anymore available, there'd be no path to even having that discussion, right? So I'm not saying I'm against, I'm just kind of trying to get my head around what choices, because right now, although they're cumbersome, we can approve many things with the CUP process, where if that doesn't exist anymore, that wouldn't be a path, right?
Correct. And so how it's drafted right now, or how I would propose to draft it, is there would no longer be the CUP path for the exception. And the reason for that is that those items I mentioned before, you have to base that decision off of something. And so we could build in criteria in which a unique situation may be presented where you could grant that approval. But we're trying to build standards into this code that we're all comfortable with, that we're all sort of on the same page with. And so making exceptions here and there for different things is sort of a path we're trying to get away from in general terms. Now, is it something that we could retain? Yes, absolutely. Will it potentially create a situation in the future for you guys where people are abusing this exception because they are trying to skirt the rules and standards in place that we all came up with that we feel comfortable with? Absolutely. That's a possibility. So I'm open to it if that's like, we need an alternative, but I think there's just cons to it is all I'm getting at, so.
Well, since we're just doing initial
Yeah.
feedback. I definitely see the upside of proposing, expanded, more permissibility and having a
Yep.
larger number of things that are automatically just acceptable. I think that said, I think that oftentimes this body's approach in my experience has been that we want usually to get to a yes. And if we have the stakeholders at the table and everybody's fine, we try, in my experience, to try to make it
Right.
work. And so although I'm very enthusiastic about very much of this, I'm not sure that I'm in favor of the part that says, well, that we're going to take away the path to getting to yes sometimes.
Okay.
So I see the upside. I think I also see the downside.
Yeah. Yeah, and these are sort of some of the tough decisions that we're gonna have to make collectively through this process is where are we gonna sort of hold the line in terms of these are the things that we're comfortable with and where do we need to build in. We're inherently making the code significantly more flexible than it is today, but inevitably we cannot predict every single situation that will be presented to you. So do we need that exception is what we're getting at, yeah. So that is something to discuss in some future meetings, absolutely. All right, now moving into a little bit in relationship to land uses. So the bulk dimensional standards that are there orient density in relationship to setback, height, lot coverage, those types of things. Additionally, within the existing code, you have land use based density standards, which calls for 3 to 4 units per building or 5 to 24 units per building. And there's either a conditional use permit process in one district or permitted by right in a different district. So that's what we're talking about in terms of the existing cap on density from a land use perspective. So what we've come up with is sort of utilizing the same approach where I'm calling it a hybrid form-based, unit-based approach, meaning that it's still retaining the bulk dimensional standards as a form of density and still retaining that land use as a form of density, but taking a slightly different approach to it. So what you can see in the table here is single family, for example, that's defined by a land use maximum of 1 unit. That's permitted in a wide variety of zoning districts. 2 family, that's again a land use based metric that would be accommodated in each of those mixed residential zoning districts. Then what we have is sort of small scale multifamily and then potentially larger scale multifamily. So what a typical metric that I've used in other codes, and this could be customized further if we need to, but 12 units is typically where we find that you've probably heard the term missing middle housing. And so that's something where you see the 2 families, maybe 3 family stacked, 4 unit building, townhomes, smaller scale multifamily that may fit in a wide variety of areas of the community. And so that's where we get to that mixed residential 2 zoning district. When we get above that to the mixed residential 3 in terms of density, that's where I'm proposing to use a form-based approach rather than a unit cap approach. And the reason for that is using the setbacks, the height, and the lot sizes gives the ability for some flexibility, whereas the unit cap itself can be very difficult for these higher density projects or for a unique circumstance. For example, you could use the zoning map amendment to go from mixed residential 2 to mixed residential 3 to provide that type of flexibility. That's where you'd have the ability to, again, use that process to make that change and to weigh those options. But the classic scenario I use is what's the difference between 12 studios or 12 1-bedrooms and 18 studios. And it's not much if the building footprint itself doesn't change. It's just the reconfiguration of the unit itself. And so when we're talking about a cap of 24 being sort of the highest that we have today, I think we need inherently more flexibility than that to accommodate a variety of different situations that we may see in standalone residential situations. Additionally, what I would propose is that within each of the mixed use scenarios, that would be more of the downtown all the way up to, or downtown corridor and neighborhood, you would again use that form-based scenario. So there'd be some requirement for a mixing of uses, commercial and residential, but how you configure those residential within that building footprint that you have defined by the bulk standards would be where you could ultimately build out. So you could build up to a maximum of the height, up to a maximum of the setback within that building footprint if it accommodated it, rather than saying it's a maximum of 20 units, just making up a number. So that's sort of what we're orienting it to. It's still giving you the ability to regulate things in a way that's not that dissimilar to today, but it's giving you the ability, hopefully, to account for more flexibility in the future using some of those other districts that build in the opportunity to create or accommodate unique situations or higher density where it makes sense through that zoning map amendment process. Does that overall make sense? I know it's tried to make it a little less complicated, but this is what I just explained, so I don't need to go through it. But the classic scenario would be a 30-unit apartment building is proposed in the mixed residential 2 zoning district. Well, Brian would say, well, then you need a zoning map amendment to go to MR3, the mixed residential 3, to accommodate that within the, the bulk standards, if they can be met. And then you guys would review that and you'd review the site plan associated with it. So that's where you would get the control versus a conditional use process, but you would also provide that flexibility as well. Okay. Mixing of uses, we've talked about this in a couple of different other questions. What I mean by that is residential and commercial in the same building. Right now, you have some ability to do that by right, some by conditional use, but really how it's oriented today is mixed use says ground floor is all commercial, up above can be residential. As you can probably see in a variety of different places, whether it's, Sun Prairie and Madison or out in Waukesha County, and it's moving closer to Jefferson County and Dodge as well, is these mixed use buildings that are appearing on commercial corridors with maybe a corner or a quarter of the ground floor that's commercial and the rest is residential. That is how some of these can be market feasible in terms of new construction. And so what we're attempting to do is basically say mixed use is permitted by right in all of these zoning districts, but we're going to customize it by zoning district in terms of what we mean by mixing of uses. So what we have, and we'll get into this more with part 1, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an orientation, is that downtown, especially along Main Street, I would foresee that we would still require ground floor commercial. I think there's a strong faction of the community that supports that, and that's what's written in the comprehensive plan. When we get outside of that downtown core area, that's where a little bit more flexibility might be needed. And so if you see the image in the middle, and I don't know the interior of this building to know if this is the case, but would it really matter to us, generally speaking, if that corner is commercial and there's a residential unit or 2 on the ground floor behind it? Well, under the existing standards, right, today we couldn't allow that to happen because it says commercial only on the ground floor. And so what we would be proposing is, again, we're going to say blanket mixed use is permitted by right, but we're going to customize the approach to the different areas of the community based on zoning district as to what that ultimately looks like. So I know I'm going through big topics in a very quick way, so stop me if I'm not, if you're not catching on to something, but hopefully this is sort of all making sense and things we've, generally high level talked about in the past. Yeah. Okay. Institutional residential. This is distinctly different than our traditional, or not traditional, typical, I would say, residential formats where we're talking about a nursing home or a limited care facility, rehab center. I think homeless shelter might fall under this, and I know that that is at the forefront of a discussion currently ongoing. Right now, institutional residential is permitted as a conditional use in the multifamily zoning districts, the neighborhood and business office and the planned office zoning districts. So from that perspective, we're using the conditional use to regulate it right now. Now, Brian and I discussed it. It goes beyond just like a homeless shelter. I don't want to bog down the whole conversation with that one particular. I want us to focus on, these are unique situations that may be distinctly different than what we see in a single family, two family, multifamily kind of setting. They typically have a care associated with them. They have outside employees coming to the property to take care of either people or the property itself. So one way to get away from the conditional use process, again, sort of beating a dead horse on that one, but getting away from that process, what we thought of potentially doing is saying that that land use is permitted within the institutional zoning district, but not any other zoning district. Meaning that if you want to do this, it doesn't mean it can't be done. But what it means is that we're going to use the zoning map amendment process to say, does this make sense or not, versus the conditional use process. And so there'd still be bulk dimensional standards, there'd still be a site plan, all of those things. And it might well end up in a neighborhood. Like it might be well suited for a neighborhood. Think of a nursing home that has very low impacts. Maybe this makes sense. That would just be the zoning map amendment to make that happen. It just gives the city a little bit more control than sort of saying it's permitted by right in all of these districts that it is today. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, our last topic, one that is another source of needing, in my view, some additional regulation is personal storage. And today, it's permitted as a conditional use in the business districts and the industrial districts. You also have a distance requirement, meaning that you have to have a distance between an existing personal storage and a new personal storage. And I believe that that provision came about to try and get at dissuading these types of uses from locating along our commercial corridors. Personal storage land uses are the lowest taxable value that you can have in those commercial settings. They produce very little, if at any, community benefit whatsoever. They are very easy and cheap to build and to construct and to rent and to operate. So you have this dichotomy of people want to do them. There is a demand, don't get me wrong, but from a community planning and economic development perspective, they are the lowest value thing that you could possibly get along your commercial corridors. So what, as it's drafted, what an alternative we're proposing is making it permitted in the industrial districts, but no longer allowing it to be permitted within the business, the mixed use, the commercial zoning districts. And essentially that would make the existing non-conforming that we have today. We could continue to keep the distance requirements and continue to allow it in the business district if you guys think that that makes sense. I'm just providing, again, an alternative approach that I've used in other communities and that I would recommend for the reasons that I talked about. Do we have an idea on this one? If we're comfortable with this approach or if we're more comfortable with the existing approach?
Well, I know one area that we struggle in, it's like with storage units, it's hard to say no to things if they're technically legal and allowed in a zoning district.
Correct.
So you need, to have certain criteria to substantiate your no vote.
Yes.
So anything that gives us a little more ability to say no without it just being because we want to would be helpful.
Yes. And I think that this approach would do exactly that.
I'm in favor of doing that too.
All right. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate it. We will take this feedback, continue to refine these provisions. Was there anything else on the tables before we concluded?
I do have at least one more question. Thank you. So, have you contemplated, and maybe a lot, maybe not a lot, some of the bitterest disputes that I've seen in the recent past have been related to the so-called the right to repair or the right to reconstruct on the existing footprint of something that you already own.
Yes.
To talk to me a little bit about that. So, I mean, I don't know if that would really be directly affected by anything that we're talking about here, but there are some state and local protections for people. I mean, if you are the owner occupant, of course, of a house that burns down, and my understanding is the state prevents cities from limiting my reconstruction of my house, even if it was non-conforming to setbacks and stuff like that. So, I think that's a pretty sensible protection for citizens. I mean, I understand there's a dilemma here between people who are on plan commissions and city councils versus citizens. You know, in my capacity as a plan commission member, I might want to move in the direction of having, greater city flexibility. As a citizen, I might want to have, frankly, more CUPs because
Yeah.
I'm protected. And if I meet the conditions of my city ordinance, I get my CUP.
Right.
So I'm just thinking some of that through for the first time, and I guess I'm kind of curious to
From
hear how much
the-
you battled with some of that already.
From the non-conforming situation, the structures, you're absolutely correct. A fire, what's classified as an act of God, like a natural disaster, knocks down your structure. If you prove to staff where your existing structure was located, you have the ability by right, by the state, to reconstruct in that configuration. It's on the burden of proof of the property owner to prove that this is where my structure was, this is how it looked, and whatever. But that is afforded to them within the state statutes. Additionally, one thing we will get into, and this is to try and create a little bit more ease when we're getting into creating these new standards, is to make existing structures, lots and sites fully conforming through the code. So everything that's out there today is good. It's conforming. You cannot create a further nonconformity, meaning if your building is 10 feet from the road and the setback is 15 feet, you can't go further towards the road, but you have the ability to stay within the footprint, within that 10 foot that you have today. And so that same goes with a site. So you're redoing the parking lot. Our new standard says you need to be 5 feet of separation from the property line. I guarantee you there are a bunch of parking lots that are built all the way up to the property line today. That conforming status would allow that to continue. It's when you're doing something new, you're creating a new parking lot, that is when this standard is coming into play. And so what we try to do is build in inherent flexibility with this code to say what is out there today is legal conforming, and try and remove that non-conforming clout from property owner titles, and say that from henceforth, the adoption of this code, this is where we're going, but what's out there today is okay. And that's trying to balance the exact approach you're talking.
Thank you.
And it looks like we're increasing the maximum impervious surface area coverage on some of the districts, particularly in the single-family residential. My concern, and maybe we can talk about this after the meeting, would be in a redevelopment situation causing a flooding scenario downstream. So right now we have peak discharge requirements for new development. Those don't exist for redevelopment. So if a site has a lot of green space and it's redeveloped with a lot of impervious surface and we don't have to meet that requirement, we might be causing flooding downstream. So just getting ahead of that scenario sooner than later.
Yeah, I think the struggle balance that we need to strike, right, is what you're saying versus providing flexibility to use the existing lot beyond what we have today. And one metric that I've used that I like versus like a building coverage is impervious surface. Because then from your perspective, from the stormwater perspective, you have an understanding of what sort of the maximum is on that site. And then it also increases the ability for it to be more easily understood and less interpretations. What classifies as, the building coverage versus the lot coverage, for example, is the classic scenario you run into all the time. And so those impervious surface standards are the metric that I prefer to use. Now, customizing that to best fit Watertown, I took a stab at it to start with, but that doesn't mean that what I'm proposing is perfect. And so I want to refine them with you, Andrew. I also don't want to, I want to inherently take the sort of what can we support from increasing that ability for a given lot within the parameters of stormwater management.
Thank you. And I think that makes sense. I think the impervious surface is easier to administer. It might just be tweaking our stormwater code or seeing what other folks are doing. So we can talk about this in more detail later.
Absolutely. Okay. Yes,
So if I understood you correctly, so anything that's existing now is okay.
yes.
Is that the same as you hear people say, oh, I've been grandfathered into something, so therefore I have the right to whatever it is?
Yeah, that's a very common synonym to what I was just saying.
Okay, just
Anybody else?
All right. Appreciate the time. Thank you all.
Okay,
And we'll be back in the months to come.
yeah, thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Okay. Okay, I'll look for, if there's nothing else. look
make a
for-
motion to adjourn.
Okay, motion by Kenizer. Second by Krieger. Okay, all those in favor say aye.
I
Opposed? Okay, it is 5:20. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Brad.
You're welcome. Thanks for your patience with my technical difficulties.
Okay, all good. I've had some in the past too.
Yeah, thank you.